Well, thank you so much for joining us, Clay. It's really nice to have you here. Let's just dive straight into it.
Right.
Could you maybe start with just telling us who you are, what are you working on, and what got you started on this path?
So I'm what's referred to as an existential psychologist, which really that means that I'm interested in how humans approach the big questions in life. And so there are a lot of characteristics about our species that make us unique. And a lot of different things make us unique. But one thing that I'm particularly interested in is in our unique ability to really introspect about the nature of our existence, our self-consciousness, our self-awareness, our ability to like move the self through time. We can think about the future and the past. So we have this relationship with ourselves that we think is fairly distinct relative to other organisms and these sort of self-conscious abilities, these like introspective abilities. And that has tremendous implications for how we live. And, whether we're talking about mental health or whether we're talking about economic dynamism, I mean, you can think of all sorts of topics that might seem on the surface unrelated, but I think are all connected to these existential questions that drive human activity, that inspire our goals and endeavors. And so that's kind of what I'm interested in. I was an academic for many years. I was a professor, so I really started out my career studying these questions in the laboratory, doing kind of cognitive and motivational psychology and just doing basic research, scholarly research, being a professor, teaching classes on human motivation and personality and existential psychology and the self and things like that. But several years ago, I started doing more writing for the general public. And what that did is it caused me to realize, A, how interested people are in psychology, which shouldn't be surprising. I mean, we're interested in ourselves. But B, how little access the average person has to evidence-based psychology. Like there's a ton of self-help content out there, and some of it's good and some of it's not. And there's a ton of different opinions and ideas out there, and some of those are good and some of those aren't. But really, there is this kind of barrier, this wall between the academy and the general public. Obviously, now we have like TED Talks and other ways that researchers are kind of doing outreach to get their ideas out there. But most of the scholarly work is either paywalled or it's written in technical jargon, or it involves a lot of statistics and things that the general public just doesn't have the training or the time for. And so, but has a kind of an intuitive interest in. So that got me going down the path of, that was one of the reasons I kind of went down the path of saying, well, I like doing this work in psychology, but there's so much great content that researchers have done, scholars have done, that we need to make it more applicable to everyday life. So I started doing more writing for the public, and then eventually I ended up leaving academia and moving into the think tank space, where a lot of my job really is to translate that work, to make it more accessible, to apply it to real pressing challenges, to connect it to more interdisciplinary approaches, because of course psychology is just one piece of human life. There's economics, there's social and cultural life, there's institutions, there's law, things like that. So kind of connecting the psychology into those pieces with really the goal of helping people use the scholarship, use the research, use the ideas that so many great behavioral scientists have discovered, but use them in a practical, applied way.
I have to say, I'd never heard of like this thing of the field of existential psychology before I came across you. Is it a scientific field? Did you invent it? What is it? Tell us more.
I did not invent it. It is, you could say it's a sub-discipline of psychology that really is at the intersection of social psychology and positive psychology, in the sense that like it pulls from different disciplines, right? And so there are people who, what really makes someone an existential psychologist is they're interested in these questions of meaning, freedom, free will, like these kind of these big philosophical questions that we thought for a long time were really just something that philosophers, maybe theologians, studied, that they were maybe even inaccessible to empirical methods, right? That these are too abstract. But when social psychologists and motivational psychologists and personality psychologists and positive psychologists started approaching these questions, what they discovered is you can use some of the tools of modern behavioral science, cognitive and social psychology, to study how humans approach these questions. So, for instance, we can't tell you what the meaning of life is. That is a more philosophical endeavor. But what we can tell you is what are the things that people do that tend to be associated with or to increase or decrease perceptions of meaning, right? And so we can study how people approach these questions and sort of the outcomes of that. Is it, and so there are ways definitely to put these things under the empirical microscope that are sort of agnostic to the philosophical questions, but really help us understand how humans navigate these questions. So no, I didn't invent it. It's a very much it's just, I guess you'd say it's kind of a small subfield of psychology, but it isn't specific to like social psychologists, for instance. There are cognitive psychologists, there are neuroscientists that study existential. There's a whole like existential neuroscience like sub area that's interested in the brain processes and sort of cognitive architecture that's implicated in people's awareness of self and their like concerns about meaning.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Like I said, I didn't know it existed, so but it makes a lot of sense also, and it seems very useful to come at it from this angle as well, not just like the philosophy angle. But you're also the director at the Human Flourishing Lab. Do you want to just share a bit about what that is and what work you're doing there?
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, I was a professor for a long time, doing this stuff in the lab. And then I started working with the Archbridge Institute, which is a DC-based, nonpartisan think tank that has done a lot of work more in the policy and economic kind of space, so focusing on sort of what are some of the artificial barriers to human well-being and flourishing. But a lot of that work in the think tank world is around economic policies. But what the folks there realized was that economics is part of the story. That's not the whole story, right? Humans are psychological organisms. We have psychological needs. We have social needs. We're cultural at our core. We have spiritual interests and pursuits. So there's this whole other dimensions of the human condition that are important for flourishing that can't be just like minimized to economic policy or public policy. And so I started working with the Archbridge Institute, and we decided to launch the Human Flourishing Lab to really focus on those, more non-economic questions, connecting them, where it's appropriate to those policies. Just as like one example, you might think of like something like we've done some work in occupational licensing, and it turns out there's a lot of things that maybe people want to do, entrepreneurial kind of activities, but there are these sort of artificial barriers like, oh, you have to have a license to do this. And there's not really, in some things you can think, oh, there's a good reason for like public safety or something like that. But in a lot of these things, there's not really a great reason to, do you really need to have hundreds of hours of training to like cut hair or something? Or can we just sort of let the market sort that out? Like if you cut hair bad, you're probably going to get bad reviews online and your business isn't going to last very long. So, they focusing on things like that, but then, we can connect that to like human potential and meaning, because like if there's barriers that prevent people from really, if there's artificial barriers that prevent them from pursuing their aspirations, their goals, cultivating their talents, we see a connection there between economics, policy, and then psychology. But a lot of what I work on is not that stuff. It's more like, in a lot of ways, when there's no artificial barriers, we become our own barriers, right? Like there's nothing stopping us from doing something except our own anxiety, our own distrust of others, or polarization, or, these sorts of things that are more about our social life or cultural life and our psychological life than they are about like, government policies, for instance. And so we decided the Human Flourishing Lab should really focus on those things, because we often do create barriers to flourishing through these more cultural or psychological means. And we want to remove those barriers too, just like we want to remove economic barriers to flourishing. And also on the growth side of things, it's not just things getting in the way of us living how we want to live. We also are a very progress-oriented institute. So and of course, psychology has a lot to do I think is an underappreciated component of progress, because behind every invention or discovery are human beings, or human brains. What inspires people? What makes us curious? What makes us explorative? What makes us take risks? What makes us want to improve the world? What makes us believe the world can be improved? These are fundamentally psychological questions that relate to other domains, education, the societies we live in, individual rights, and other institutional forces. But at the heart of it is human motivation and human interest and human aspiration. And so we're very much interested in the psychology of progress as well.
Yeah, I'd love to dive more into that as well. Like, do you have do you have a definition for what you mean when you talk about human flourishing, for example? Like, and are you seeing that there are are there like the same key ingredients that keep returning both on like an individual and a societal level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so one thing that I'm not saying this makes us totally unique, but when I see a lot of people talk about flourishing, they almost talk about it as being synonymous with well-being or even happiness, or so something that's kind of an end state. Like, have you achieved flourishing? You know what I mean? Like it's a static end state. Like when everyone's flourishing, then we've won. If you look at just the word flourish, divorced from human flourishing, just the word, it's very much about like activity, about action, growth, like moving towards something. And that's how I think of human flourishing. I don't think of it as we've achieved well-being. I think of it more as we're pursuing that, and we never achieve it. Like there's always a potential for improvement. So I agree with others who see, for instance, human flourishing as multidimensional. Like you can have human flourishing in your like psychological and your spiritual life. You can have flourishing in your economic life. You get physical health. There's these other your social life, your relationships. So there's different dimensions of flourishing. I totally agree with that. But what I would emphasize is the action. I see flourishing as movement towards something, as action, as advancement, as growth. And again, I'm not saying other people don't, but a lot of the talk I see around flourishing almost thinks of it as more of a passive state. Like you either achieved it or you haven't, or you're at different levels of flourishing. Whereas I think it's more like the activity, the action, the movement towards it. And that's what we really emphasize at the lab is, one of the one this one of the challenges, something that can be like a real barrier to us as a species, is that we're never satisfied. In fact, this is why it's really good to develop the state of contentment. People will talk about it's good to be content, right? Because if you're never satisfied, then you're in a bad mood, you're frustrated. And that's true. There's definitely a downside to our dissatisfaction, but there's an upside too. The fact that humans are never satisfied is what drives us to always tinker, to always try to make things a little bit better. We would still be living the way we lived hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe, if we were just like, okay, we're content, we're satisfied. So again, I connect flourishing to that idea of like, we're always trying to make things a little bit better. And of course, we need to be careful about that. There's a downside to never being satisfied, never living in the moment, never just being content. But it's also, contentment also is a barrier, potential barrier to making things better or to improving things. And so again, I see that flourishing piece as part of that movement towards growth, towards advancement, towards positive change.
And like, how do you think we're doing on that front? Are we as a society, like, are we improving? Like, are we moving in the right direction? Are there positive trends that you're seeing or negative trends that you're seeing?
So I like the work of like humanprogress.org and some of these organizations that take a like step back and take a big historical view. And from that perspective, there's definitely tons of stuff to celebrate, right? In terms of progress, in terms of movement in the right direction, whether we're focusing on, increased life expectancy, improve the literacy rates, human rights around the world. There are definitely things to celebrate. Of course, you can focus in, you can get a little bit more microscopic and look and find areas in which we're going in the wrong direction even, or we're kind of stuck. or there's some new thing that one of the challenges of progress, as you know, is like we make a discovery or an improvement that solves one problem, but unintentionally creates another. And so, getting back to we're never satisfied. And part of that is because of that, right? We create something new and we're like, oh, this is pretty cool. And this has made life easier in this way. Oh, we didn't realize that this is actually like causing damage, causing environmental damage, or this is doing something in another domain that we didn't anticipate. And so if you think about that, there's always ways to find things that are going in the wrong direction, I think. But I think it's worth looking on the whole and saying, if you had, for instance, like if you had the ability to trade today, living today for living 100 years ago, at some intuitive level, a lot of people will say, yeah, I'd rather live in the past. The past was better. But then if you drill in a little bit and you say, okay, that means you have to give up the medical advances that are available today. So you get this disease, you don't have vaccines, you don't have these different treatments. Do you want to live 100 years ago? Oh, no, no, no. You'd have to give up some of the rights that, would you want to raise your daughter 100 years ago or raise her today, which she's got more, or women have more rights. So you start getting into the specifics of progress, and then and people very much change their tune about, how the past was better. And that comes, I think, from taking that big picture view. That being said, obviously we do face some challenges. We do face some challenges today. And, one thing that I'm focused on, I mean, we face some geopolitical challenges, of course, environmental challenges and things like that. And some unknowns, like the advances in artificial intelligence. Like, I'm excited about those advances, but people have, concerns. There's a lot of unknowns around that. But one of the challenges, we're really focused on at the lab, because I'm a psychologist, and so that's kind of the domain of expertise we're focused on, is some of the growing, mental health issues, that, the attitudes. It's interesting that at the same time that we've made so many advances in people today, especially in the West, United States, Europe, Britain, these places, like, in a lot of ways, life is so much better, and we have so many more opportunities to do what we want with our lives. We have so much more autonomy, so much more potential. We know so much more about human behavior and motivation. And yet at the same time, we're seeing growing pessimism, particularly among younger generations. We're seeing growing rates of depression and anxiety. So, we might have a lot of material progress, but it seems like this is a debatable issue. There are people that think our mental health, that we're exaggerating this problem. Not me personally exaggerating it, but like our conversations are exaggerated around it. But there does seem to be something going on with the attitude of people, and maybe particularly younger generations. And, we do a lot of survey work at the lab. And so, as with others, and, our results kind of converge with the results of other people doing national surveys, where we find, for instance, that, a lot of young people do report higher levels of poor mental health than older generations, higher levels of loneliness or social disconnection than older generations, greater pessimism about the future, more pessimism than optimism, for instance. So I think those are real challenges where we're going in the wrong direction, and we definitely need a different psychology around these issues. I think that's more hopeful and positive and aspirational, more positive sum.
Yeah, I guess that's what we're trying to do. What do you have any like? What do you think are the most major opportunities that you see for advancing human flourishing?
I think that a theme that's really, really big for us is agency, and this idea that part of what makes humans so cool isn't just that we're smart. I think it isn't just that we're creative. It isn't just that we're able to sort of have, dominion over the planet and manipulate the material world in ways that no other organism can. All those things are incredible, but the reason we do those things is important. And this gets back to that existential question. It's our self-consciousness. It's our ability to reflect on ourselves and ask questions like, who am I? What is my purpose? What can I do to make a difference in the world? How can I be part of something that transcends my brief time on this planet? As far as we know, we're the only organism that seriously grapples with an awareness of our mortality, for instance. And that can be terrifying, but it can also be inspiring because it means we might say, I know I'm only going to be here for so long. And if I'm lucky, we're talking maybe 100 years, but I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. Or, I mean, anything can happen. There's lots of things outside of my control. But what can I do with the time I have to be part of something transcendent, part of something bigger? Of course, for many people, there's a spiritual and religious dimension of that. How am I part of something larger than myself, and how am I connected to the divine, or something that is literally transcendent? But also for others who are less religious or not religious at all, and even for people who are religious, for all of us, there's this more like what's referred to as symbolic immortality. This idea of like, I want to, even when I'm gone, I want to have made a difference where I, in some way. And this doesn't have to be grand. I mean, when you say these things, people think, oh, you want to have buildings named after you, or cure disease, or those are aspirations. But even just making a positive difference in your family, like living on in the memories of others who know that you were here, that you made a mark, that you did something important. It doesn't have to be grand. It's just making that contribution. And that connects to the theme of agency, because when we ask these questions, when we pursue these aspirations, we're only able to really do them and to achieve our potential when we recognize that at the end of the day, we have to take responsibility for that. Like, we have to say, I can't control the fact that I'm mortal, at least not currently. Like, but I can control how I live. Like, I can control the decisions I make to do something positive, impactful in this world. And that's empowering. That's true empowerment, right? To be like, there's a lot of things that I can't control who my parents are, where I was born. There's a lot of things outside of my control, but I can control my thoughts and my actions. And that sense of agency, I think cultivating that, regardless of the culture you're in, regardless of like the community you're in, regardless of the career or trade you pursue, regardless of your, all these other little ways that influence how we organize our lives. To me, that's fundamental to living a productive and meaningful life.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, there's definitely like, I think that's something that has come up for us many times with the Existential Hope Project, like agency being one of the things that, if to have people feel hopeful about the future, they need to have some agency over it. And also on the aging thing, I mean, there's definitely people that are trying to take control and like, use the agency that they have to make sure that they can continue living and so on.
Yeah. And even those of us who don't have grand aspirations of living hundreds of years or beyond, or having our consciousness uploaded or into the cloud or anything like that, like things that seem kind of sci-fi, even just taking care of our health. For instance, there's research showing that people who have a strong sense of meaning tend to live longer. And part of it is because when you feel meaningful, you do feel more agentic, you feel motivated, and you feel like you have a reason to exist. And when you feel like you have a reason to get up each day, you're just more likely. It doesn't mean you're immune from bad choices, but what it does mean is you're more likely to make good choices. You're more likely to say, like, I have a reason to be here. I should probably take care of myself. And so, meaning is one of the strongest predictors of all sorts of things, such as vulnerability to psychopathology. So people who have a low sense of meaning are just more likely to suffer from depression. And it's not just to suffer from depression, but in terms of like being treatment compliant. Like, if you do have depression and you want to get better, meaning is critical. If you can, whether you're seeing a therapist or engaging in some other type of intervention, it's when you feel a sense of meaning that you're motivated to be treatment compliant, when you're motivated to do the hard work to get better. And a lot of things that involve, whether it's addiction or depression or, phobias or, a lot of things that can be barriers to mental flourishing require hard work. They're not, they're not easy fixes. And you're just more motivated to want to put that hard work in, to persist, to be resilient if you have a sense of meaning. You're more motivated to go to the gym. You're more motivated to do all sorts of things. And one other thing I'll say about that, connecting that agency to the theme of progress and maybe broader societal health, is it turns out that meaning actually pushes you outward. And so when the biggest predictor of meaning is feeling socially significant, like feeling like I matter. Like I have a place in this world where I'm making a difference, positive impact. When you feel that, you feel meaningful. And so, but that's a very outward oriented thing. Like to matter means you're in the game, right? You're doing something. You're involved with others. You're engaged in social life in some way, in community life in some way. This can be parenting. This can be work. Your work. This can be philanthropy. This could be volunteer work. There's lots of ways in which you can matter in lots of domains of life, but that pushes you outside of yourself. So, people often think of meaning as like this philosophical endeavor. And it's true that it's our ability to introspect, to ask these questions about the nature of our existence that makes us a species in search of meaning. But that's not how we find meaning. That's why we need meaning, because we can reflect on these things. But the way we find meaning actually is getting out of our head and going out and doing things in the world and making a difference in the world. And I think that's that. And so another way of thinking about connecting this to agency is agency and flourishing and meaning. All these variables, these concepts we've talked about, all involve activity, and they all involve outward-oriented activity. And it turns out this is actually, when we focus outward, it's actually good for our own mental health. So in interventions that have focused on improving mental health, they have found that doing acts of kindness towards others often works better than, kind of cognitive behavioral like therapy things where it's focused on like self-work. It's not to say that that's not important. A lot of times people really do need to work on their schemas about the world and their life. But it's when you focus your attention out towards the outer world, doing something to make a difference, to improve someone else's life, you actually get the results too. Like you're like, oh, like I'm doing something important, and that helps us develop that resilience. That's good for our own mental health.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I think I feel like we often end up talking about like how we can feel meaning or something, but maybe not so much like what we can actually do that is meaningful. So it's kind of nice if you start in that end, because then as a bonus you'll probably feel a lot of meaning as well. But yeah, I guess it's sort of starting at the philosophy angle rather than the psychology angle a bit. I'm gonna skip in the conversation a little bit now, because you also wrote a book on nostalgia. And I actually remember coming across your book and being like, oh, wow, I have to read this, because I feel like I enjoy feeling nostalgia, but it's a bittersweet feeling, but it's like a little bit addictive. But I don't feel good about feeling nostalgia, because it feels like, well, it's not productive, or like, how do I use this? But it's nice to hear you say that it's actually like, it can be used as a vehicle for progress. So tell us more about this. Like, what do you think? Like, what role does nostalgia play in guiding us toward a better future?
I've been studying nostalgia for almost 25 years, about 25 years. When I first started doing research in nostalgia, my view of nostalgia was it must serve some kind of function. It appears to be universal. It appears to be something that people do regardless of their background and even age. It probably does something for us. And what I thought of it as what sometimes we refer to as a psychological defense, which is people face some type of psychological threat that makes them feel uncertain or anxious and unhappy. And they turn to these memories from the past that are comforting. And so it's good for us because it's restorative. That was my, it provides a defense. That was my first thinking on it. And we started doing studies looking at that. And we found evidence for that. Like if we had people, think about an anxiety provoking or kind of threatening topic, whether it's thinking about a time where they were rejected by somebody, or thinking about their own mortality, or thinking about where they really failed to reach, to achieve a goal, that increased nostalgia. People became more nostalgic after those experiences of psychological threat. And then nostalgia did, in fact, seem to restore their mood. But then what we started to discover is it seemed like nostalgia was more than a defense. So, for instance, one of the things we did, and this was when I was a professor at the University of Southampton, which is in the southern coast of England, we in Southampton's a city that over 90% of it was destroyed by German bombing during World War II. And we were going out and we were collecting nostalgic narratives from older adults in the community. And this was about 20 years ago or so. And we were just having them share with us, write down, like we were giving them paper basically, and like write down a nostalgic memory, like detail it and how it makes you feel. And a lot of these people were writing about memories from, their childhood during the war that were, these aren't things they want to go back to. It was a very unpleasant time. But there were life lessons in there. They would say things like, our family was really close, and we realized how precious life is and how important family is, and things like that. And then an interesting component is oftentimes we'd see, not just if they were writing about that time period, but writing about all sorts of parts of their life, we'd often see this, like, in the narrative, a mention of hope. This makes me feel hopeful for the future, or this makes me grateful. And so we started to think of nostalgia doesn't just like provide comfort, it actually might be inspirational in a way, right? Because when you think about, when you're living in the moment, when something's going bad, or the world seems like it's chaotic, or everything's in the wrong direction, and then you look to this past and you pull from it the memories that you think were good or meaningful, it takes you out of that moment of despair and says, well, we've had good times in the past. Like, we've had experiences of love and connection, of achievement, rites of passage that feel meaningful. We've had these things in the past, so we could have them again. Like, there's nothing magical about the past. And so then we started to, it was really like studying these narratives that made us think that, well, we should start doing experiments. We're not measuring the potential, like, positive or growth side of nostalgia. We're just measuring the defense side. And you can only discover what you measure, what you choose to measure. And so we started looking at nostalgia not just as a psychological defense, but perhaps as a source of growth. And we found that when we induced nostalgia, when we had people spend a few minutes reflecting on a nostalgic experience, they actually became more optimistic about the future. They actually reported a greater motivation to pursue their goals. They actually felt more empathetic towards others. We've done research showing that nostalgia makes people people come up with more creative solutions to problems after nostalgia. And so that made us think that, oh, wow, nostalgia isn't just a source of comfort. It actually is a source of inspiration. And then, once you have that kind of epiphany, then you start looking around and you're like, oh yeah, look at all the entrepreneurs out there that are creating things, and they have memories from their childhood or from their youth that inspired them. Look at all the people in the space of progress. Look at all the futurists, the people that are really, really focused on the future, and go talk to them. They've all got memories of the science fiction they read when they were kids, or the experience they had that made them think, oh, wow, that we could solve problems. We can build technologies that improve life for people. Everyone that I've met that's in the space of progress, even the ones, which there are many that are actually quite skeptical of nostalgia, don't realize how nostalgic they are and how much they're using their own nostalgia for progress. So, I went to this event one time, and there was a person talking about all these barriers to progress, and they listed nostalgia as one of them. Not even like 2 minutes later, the same individual, I won't call anyone out by name, but the same individual was talking about how there was a period of time in our country where we were optimistic, and where we built things, and where dynamism thrived, and where people weren't so cynical about everything, and where we saw ourselves as aspirational. And, it's funny because it was like they were engaging in a kind of historical nostalgia just moments after criticizing nostalgia, with no self-awareness of how nostalgia for progress is so important. And so that's, whether we're talking about personal nostalgia, which is our own autobiographical memories, or more of a historical or collective nostalgia, which is like this broader type where we look to past eras. Same thing with like social activists. People will talk about like civil rights, and they'll have like kind of a nostalgia for that and say, oh, we achieved all these things. And that can inspire like current efforts to advance human rights. And so I think that we often just neglect that side of nostalgia, because the kind of stereotype of nostalgia is it's just getting stuck in the past, and you're just looking at the glory days, or you're romanticizing the past in ways that become barriers to progress. And certainly that can obviously happen. People can take nostalgia in an unhelpful direction. But from our research and from my experience, I think most of the time for most people, what they're doing is they're using, when the present is uncertain, they don't know which direction to take, when they feel overwhelmed, when they feel despair, when they feel disconnected in some way, when they lack a sense of purpose, they pull from the bank of nostalgic memories and nostalgic inspiration, not to hide from the present or to avoid the future, but to find like the confidence and the inspiration and the motivation to move forward with courage and with inspiration. And so that way, I think nostalgia is a critical ingredient. It's not a barrier to progress. It's actually a critical ingredient of progress.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I feel like I've been at a lot of these. I recognize these conversations as well, where like, there's like we need to look forward
and it's not that they don't have a point. It's not like it's not black and white. It's not, you can see a weaponization of nostalgia, and there are red flags. Like if someone starts saying things like, oh, the past was so much better, I think then there's definitely, it's important to have some nuance and to say, okay, what is it about the past specifically that you think was better? And maybe you're wrong about that, or life's complicated. There are elements of the past that maybe we can draw from and we can improve. And, certainly in the creative space, we've done some work looking at how young people, Gen Z in particular, uses historical nostalgia. And it turns out it's really fascinating. Young people are actually some of the most nostalgic people for past before their time. And this is what we call historical nostalgia. And whether it's fashion or music or film or analog technology, you see a lot of interest in the past before, especially before the digital era. And it's not that young people are saying, oh, we want to go back to the past and give up our like cool gadgets and the progress we've made. What they're really saying, and I'm not saying they're saying this consciously, but what they're doing is they're saying, no, there's interesting elements of the past. There's wisdom in the past. There's things that we can learn from that we think are fascinating. And also we want to be connected. Like we want that cultural continuity. Life is changing so fast. There's so many, culture changes, technology changes, and we want to feel connected to previous generations. And we also want to learn like, oh, there's things about like physical analog technology that's fulfilling, that's enriching. But it's not that young people are saying, oh, I'm collecting vinyl records because I don't want to have Spotify anymore. They're saying I want both, right? They're saying there's something really cool about the advances we've made that make it so easy to access all sorts of media content. I love that. It's great. But at the same time, there is something about the physical, material, tangible, analog experience, and I want to have that as well. So I don't think of it as like, like nostalgia isn't something like, oh, I'm rejecting modern life. I'm rejecting progress to go backwards. It's saying, no, there's lots of interesting things from the past that we can pull from, and then we can be creative and intentional and integrating that into future development, and that's the creative side of nostalgia really, is it's like, you see, like, for example, there are some car companies, I believe, that are sort of moving away from touch screens and back towards analog knobs, because people really like that. It's hard to like always look at stuff when you're driving. People like to feel things, and there's something about that tactile experience. And so progress is always this sort of back and forth between, let's experiment with this. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. And sometimes you're like, oh, it turns out like in the past, they kind of figured something out. Like we can integrate that in, and maybe it just needs, a little update or a little upgrade. And so that I think that creative side of using nostalgia and innovation and creativity is really important.
Yeah. Do you think that how do we best use nostalgia for existential hope? Do you think there's anything we could do there?
When we go throughout life, we kind of collect these experiences that are meaningful, that we see as self-defining. Often they're triumphs, when we've really accomplished something, especially if we didn't think we could, or it was really difficult, and we're proud of that. And we can pull on those experiences when we're going through something, even that seems totally different. So maybe you're in your 40s or 50s and you're at work and there's some technological change happening and you just kind of feel old and like, oh, I can't keep up with, what the young people are doing, and you sort of lose your like confidence. Your nostalgic memories can sort of re-energize that sense of youth that like, oh, when I was younger, I had to do all sorts of new things that I had never done before. And it was scary and it was difficult and I made mistakes and maybe made a fool of myself. But I kept going and I triumphed, and that improved my life in some way. And so our nostalgic memories, even in other areas of our life, can often help us like feel young and energized and creative and inspired. And we can pull from those to like help us generate hope. It's really, really useful to step out of the present. So, again, earlier we were talking about contentment, and oftentimes there's a real focus on living in the moment, understandably, because we live in such a distracted modern world. When there's so many different things competing for our attention, it's often hard just to like take a breath and like look around and appreciate what's going on. So that's definitely important. But one of our superpowers is mental time travel, which is not living in the moment, but instead saying, I'm going through something difficult, or there's something coming down there, something I kind of fear about the future. And I can step out of that time. I can step out of the moment and look back and pull from these meaningful memories. And not to mention the fact that, progress and, very much hinges on our ability to travel mentally into the future, to say, oh, this is the life I want to live. You don't, save money every month. You don't take money out of your paycheck every month and put it in a retirement account because you hate having more money right now. You do it because you can mentally time travel to the future and you're trying to plan, right? So that ability, that goal striving ability, is very much about our mental time travel. You don't get up every day and train for a marathon, because you just like running at 5 a.m. You do it because you're thinking, oh, there's this end goal that in 3 months or 6 months or whenever that I hope to accomplish. And so that ability to mentally time travel to the future allows us to be a goal-oriented species. Likewise, traveling to the past allows us to pull inspiration and wisdom and connection and love and guidance that can be really helpful for promoting hope. Even something as simple as you move to a new city, you don't know anyone, you feel lonely. Loneliness is one of the biggest drivers of nostalgia. When people feel lonely, they become nostalgic, because nostalgia so often involves relationships. And so you become nostalgic for your friends and family. You miss them. You're thinking about these memories. Often what that does is that gives you that confidence. It's like, oh, I've built relationships before. I have people that care about me. I can form new relationships. I can go out in the world and meet new people. And so nostalgia can give us that sense of confidence that's really critical to hope.
Thank you. I think that's some good advice. On just moving on to talk more about existential hope, I guess. What's your take on the future? Are you feeling optimistic about humanity's future? And do you think, and also since you're an existential psychologist, be interested in hearing do you think that it's important that we feel optimistic or hopeful about the future? Is it important to have that as a zeitgeist in society?
Absolutely. So first, I am optimistic. And it's not that I have some belief that life just is, things just always naturally get better. Quite the opposite. I think progress requires a lot of work, or requires humility, or requires a recognition that we're biased, that we're prone to make mistakes, that, no single person or philosophy or group has all the answers. So it revolves a lot. Progress involves a lot of work and understanding and cooperation and compromise and all that stuff. And it's not easy. But I'm optimistic because, for one, like we already talked about, you look back in time and you're like, wow, like we've created some problems for ourselves, but we've solved a lot of problems too. We've made it much easier for people to live longer and healthier lives. Again, we have some barriers and we definitely have a ways to go, but I am optimistic. And yes, I think that is important, not just optimism. So, researchers often get into the weeds about the difference between optimism and hope. And there is, I think, a critical difference. They're both important, but optimism is more of like just an attitude. It's more of it's like a dispositional attitude, like, oh, like I just think things will be better. And that's good. Um, but hope is adding in an agency component. It's, and then the research on hope, that sense of agency, is actually critical, because when you're hopeful for the future, what you're saying is you're optimistic, like that you think the future will be better, but there's more of an appreciation that actually requires doing the things that make it better. So hopeful people are more motivated, they're more inspired, they're more resilient. And so without hope, you don't see that, going back to like the idea of flourishing being movement or being towards something. Without hope, you often see passivity. You often see people like throwing in the towel, or you see like hedonism sort of prioritized as a goal. It's like, well, if I can't do anything to improve the world, I might as well just like get mine. I might as well just have a good time and enjoy my life. Hope is saying, no, there are things that can improve the world, which is going to require some effort. So I think hope and positive, like optimism, hope, like a positive attitude about the future are critical, like for any culture that's going to flourish, any society that's going to advance human progress. If you want the world to be a better place, here's another way of saying it. If you want the world to be a better place, you have to believe it can be a better place, and you have to believe that people can make it a better place. Like it's not just going to happen automatically, right? Like that it requires work. And I think hope has that self-regulatory dimension, right? That motivational dimension of like, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and let's do the work.
Yeah, there's a really great article that I'll link from the resource page for this episode. It's literally called "Hope is Not Optimism," and it's by a hope psychologist named David Feldman that I found really useful when, just starting to dive into this.
Yeah, that's awesome. And also we have just a little to promote the lab's work a little bit. One of the things we try to do is make research more accessible to the general public and not paywalled in an accessible language. And so we actually we published a paper called The Science of Hope, which is a pretty comprehensive literature review on all the behavioral science around hope, from how it affects our personal lives to our communities and to the broader societal flourishing. And so if you're just interested in the science of hope, it's something that anyone can, it's a general audience read, but it's comprehensive, and it's a good way for organizations or direct service groups or anyone that's like, oh, like we would like to inspire hope among our students or among our clients or the people we're working with. It's a good starting point. So that's just to promote a lot of the work we're doing in the lab. That's one of the things we're trying to do, is take this important research, because you're right, like there's a difference between optimism and hope, and it's important to like help people sort of realize that, how they can be a bit more surgical. I think in general, a lot of people in either the progress space or people who are just trying to improve the world sort of understand that a positive attitude's important, but then it's kind of useful to get into the nuances of the research and to be like, okay, like let's get it a little bit more precise, a little bit more surgical about what are the specific types of positive thinking that are useful, and how do you cultivate that, and how does that relate to the action part of it? And hope definitely has that action orientation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and also very, very relevant promotion, I think, and it couldn't very, very well suited. And yeah, I would love to hear, like, could you share a vision of a future where you would say, like, human flourishing is maximized, and what would that look like? What's a really exciting future for you?
I think a future in which more people all over the world have the opportunity to pursue, like some of where I'm operating from a position of privilege in the United States where, of course, there are still barriers, but there's a lot of opportunity for people to say, if I believe in myself, if I understand my potential, I can pursue it. But there are a lot of places in the world where, that people live in authoritarian dictatorships. They live in, there aren't healthy institutions where it's hard for them to realize their potential. So I think one thing is more of that global perspective on flourishing is advancing human rights, advancing essentially what I would think are, the sort of the foundations of classical liberalism, whether we're talking about free speech or free trade, or free markets, things that really give people the opportunity to identify and pursue their talents, cultivate their potential, and, live fulfilling lives. So that, that's at some basic level. But then even once you would, let's just say you have an optimal, we never will, because, like I said, humans are biased. We don't have all the answers. We need a certain level of humility. We're always going to have important debates around policy and politics and all these different things because there aren't simple solutions. We're complex. So that's always going to exist. But even if we reach some sort of place where it's like we figure out how, within reason, to sort of optimize our society in terms of the institutions, in terms of the regulations and things like that, where people there aren't artificial barriers to people. Everyone has access to good education and good opportunities to pursue their talents and so forth. Even in that world, you still need that psychology piece. You still need, and this is what we were talking about earlier about like the depression, anxiety, and like the pessimism in some of the most affluent, most free countries in the world. You're seeing, these negative attitudes, these, you might say like a negative vibe, a pessimistic or cynical vibe. So even if you can optimize the institutions and society or, those sort of external things, which again, you will never reach perfection, but even if you can improve those, you still have to have the psychology piece. And so another component is not just people have the freedom to pursue the lives, but also we have that culture of where we champion and we celebrate human potential and meaning making and agency and connection, social life, having connections and things like that. So I think there is a healthy psychology that also needs to be a healthy cultural attitude that also needs to be part of addressing these other challenges that and the important challenges people are focused around, whether it's, curing diseases or improving and solving issues related to climate change, developing AI in a way that's aligned with our values, increasing civil rights, human rights, all these things. Like those are all important endeavors that are still pressing in a lot of parts of the world or for the whole world, but also that psychology piece I think is critical too.
Yeah, and do you have any resources that you want to point people to? And I think this could be something that's just like inspired you and your vision, or if you think someone who maybe wants to like explore these topics that we've discussed today deeper, what would you recommend?
So I'll just throw out the cringy self-promotional stuff first, which is only, on the Human Flourishing Lab website, which is just humanflourishinglab.org. We're trying to build resources that on these themes, but there's supposedly people aren't reading that much anymore. But what I would say is there's a book called Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's short, it's accessible, it's powerful. And I think that really gets to this theme of agency and flourishing that's critical. And I would encourage anyone to read that, especially if you find yourself kind of disposed to pessimism or hopelessness, if you feel like there's, if you see the world as so corrupt, so problematic, so hopeless that you doubt your capacity to achieve your potential or to make a difference in the world, I think that's a great book that can really put some things in perspective because it shows you what a belief in agency, how that can exist even in some of the most dire circumstances. In addition to that, because because a lot of people may not want to read books, especially maybe like, classic or philosophical books that you might think of. Find the people that, here's a simple thing you can do. I think people can do if they're interested in these ideas. Just do some observation. Look at the people that you really look up to, that you think, and these could be, people in your personal life, but they could also be athletes or celebrities or entrepreneurs or people that you think are good examples of mentorship or inspiration, and look at how they approach life. And you'll find some commonalities related to agency, related to positive thinking, related to the idea of growth and self-improvement, related to hope. And so I think that's another way of thinking about things is, people like us might be more disposed to go read books and think about these things, but there's a lot of different ways to find this kind of content, and even just observationally in your life. I watched this show on Netflix called Chef's Table, and it just shows all these people all over the world that are doing really cool culinary innovative work. They're starting restaurants, they're becoming experts in that, and they're doing something really inspiring and creative. And you see people from different backgrounds and different cultures overcoming, all sorts of like personal challenges in their life, tragedies and hardship and barriers to their success. Stuff like that is like really, really inspirational, because again, you will pick one. It's like once you start thinking about agency, once you start thinking about meaning and like human potential, you start to see it everywhere. And I think that, and there's real lessons, I think, to learn from that you don't have to go read, philosophy books to do that. And yeah, and then I think there's a lot of great, there's just a lot of great resources on the internet. I think whether it's positive psychology websites or, people that are just, I'm glad to see, for all the negativity that exists on the internet, you can find these places where people really are focused more on what's going right in the world, ways in which humans are kind of awesome. We're doing things to help each other and to improve our lives, to grow as people and to improve our communities. And so you just have to go look, it's all out there. You just have to, I think, really, actualize your own agency and start looking for that stuff. And regardless of how you prefer to consume content, I think it's, the stories are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning should be mandatory reading, but if not, I'm sure, it's such a classic. I'm sure there's a good audio book production of it as well by this time.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. It should be something that high school students, I think, read. Certainly before, I would say, certainly before university, I would think, or just before, all young people should read. So yeah, I agree with that. And it's short, so
it's short. Yeah,
you can definitely consume it quickly.
Yeah, great. Well, my final question for you is just like, could you share your favorite piece of advice that you ever received?
Yes. So a great piece of advice that I received multiple times, probably regularly when I was younger, is in different forms, the most blunt form of it was mind your own business, when your parents teach you these things, but, at the core of a lot of this is like, take responsibility for yourself. And I think one of the things that I find discouraging in a lot of like online discourse is the constant like finger pointing, and here's all the ways this other group or these politicians or these people are doing bad things. And it's not to say that there's nothing there, but it's like, what I don't see much of is, here's what I can do, here's what I'm doing to take responsibility for my own life. And so I think that that's an important life lesson, that it's just much easier to focus on how other people are causing you problems instead of how you're causing your own problems and what you can do to solve your own problems. And I don't say that in some sort of like antisocial way of like people shouldn't do anything cooperatively or shouldn't focus on like these external social forces, but a lot of work there's a lot of self-work to be done, I think, in it, and that actually helps these other things, because it's like when you start to take responsibility for your life and you start focusing on that, it actually makes you better suited to sort of dispassionately look at the world and be like, okay, here's the real challenges that exist. So I think it reduces bias. It reduces like these kind of like hostile emotions that get in the way of progress. So it's a good point to start with yourself and take a responsibility for your life. And that was a lesson that I'm sure it's an ongoing lesson. I'm 48 years old. I'm sure it's, I should say I'm almost 48 years old. I'm sure it's an ongoing lesson that I can keep learning. But I remember hearing that I remember my parents telling me that when I was very young, and then hearing that throughout my life. And I think it's a good life lesson.
Yeah, good to keep in mind, and good for, all these like points on agency and everything we've gone over today as well, I think, to keep in mind that. Yeah. Well, Clay, thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, it was great to be here. Thanks so much for letting me come on and talk about the work we're doing at the lab and talk about existential psychology, which I'm always excited to do.